A manhunt, a messy start to the political season. There's a lot going on. A hug far away from home. The Prime Minister on parade at a big international get-together.
It's personally really special for me to be here. India's a country that's near and dear to me.
But the distance from Downing Street doesn't make problems at home disappear. A prison escape, prompting claims government decisions left the system strapped for cash and unsafe.
This is on the government's watch. It's down to them. They withdrew over £900 million worth of funding.
On top of the hunt for crumbling concrete in public buildings, with ministers' noises off.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing?
Stress for schools and easy picking for the opposition.
This crisis is the inevitable result of 13 years of cutting corners, botched jobs, sticking plaster politics.
And allegedly, a Westminster staffer arrested for spying for China. So we'll ask this morning, while the UK bakes, how much more can go wrong while the Prime Minister's in the Indian sun? The man responsible for jails joins us. Can the Justice Secretary tell us how on earth Daniel Khalif escaped? Jonathan Reynolds, who wants to be Labour's captain of industry, is live in the studio with us too. And an exclusive interview with these two from across the Atlantic. The head of America's military and the head of the UK's military, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin and General Mark Milley, join us from across the pond. Hello, and with us on a busy weekend for the news. Just back from his own visit to Ukraine, a national treasure, I think, Stephen Fry. Salma Shah, Conservative former advisor, who's seen plenty of government crises, and with impeccable timing, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, is with us this week. Let's take a look at what is making the news, and no surprise, a lot of the front pages go on the extraordinary story of the escape and capture of Daniel Khalif. The Independent says captured, with a picture of the canal path in West London where he was found. The Mail on Sunday has clues about how they claim spooks tracked him down using phones. The Mirror says he had bragged that he would escape from jail, but also includes a picture of that terrible earthquake in Morocco. And we can show you here some of the latest images of what is happening there. These are drone images of some of the attempts to rescue people from the rubble. An appalling situation unfolding. But what's getting a lot of tongues wagging in the UK this morning is the front page of the Sunday Times. An incredible story. Allegedly, a House of Commons staffer has been arrested on suspicion of spying for the Chinese. Well, let's kick off with that. I mean, Salma, you worked in the Home Office, among other departments. What will be going on in government right now? Now we know this.
Well, the particulars of the story are about this parliamentary researcher having influence or relationships with ministers with classified information. So if they haven't already been part of the investigation that led to his arrest, then certainly they'll be looking through to understand what contact this person had, whether there's been any breach of that classified information, and certainly what other relationships they may have been involved with this researcher.
And these are allegations at the moment, and we don't know exactly what's happened. We should be clear about that. But just briefly, how serious is something like this? If you're watching at home this morning, how much of a concern should it be?
I think it's a big concern in terms of diplomacy with China, because there are Whitehall sources that are quoted in this piece talking about this being an escalation. So I think the diplomats are going to have to do a lot of work to understand what has prompted this and what has motivated it. I think in terms of the seriousness of this researcher, it's about influence. It's not about exposing secrets, as far as we can tell at this point.
OK, well, Downing Street has said the Prime Minister's raised this, actually, with the Chinese government at the G20 summit this morning. Let's talk then about the biggest story of the week, Daniel Khalif's escape from Wandsworth Prison. Now, Stephen, not many people might know, but you actually went to jail as a teenager.
Yeah, I did.
But as an adult, you spent some time volunteering at Wandsworth Prison. So for people who've never been inside a jail, or certainly never been there, what's it like?
It's a pretty squalid place. It's crowded. It's not very happy. I've gone in to help with their radio station. They have an inmate-run radio station, which is very well done, And there are other things that come in from the outside, theatre productions and so on. They're all, I mean, charming efforts to raise the happiness levels of some very unhappy people. But it's crowded. All the London prisons are very crowded. Pentonville, I think, was built for 500 and has 1,200 or something. Charles will know better than me, of course. But it's a pretty grim situation. There's a lot of overspill, and a lot of them are waiting to go, to be sorted out into ABC and so on. And
are going off to their trials. I mean, Charlie, just briefly, because we're about to hear from the Justice Secretary, what wider problems has this thrown up?
Well, I think Wandsworth is fairly typical of most inner-city Victorian local prisons, of which there are still a huge amount that are open. And there are three things, really. It's about having enough staff of the right quality. It's about the level of overcrowding that you have. I think Wandsworth is 600 over what it was originally designed for. It's about 1,600 prisoners. And that means lots of people sharing cells that were originally designed for one person. And the third thing is about prisoners having enough to do. And what we found when we inspected Wandsworth last year was that people were largely locked in their cells for up to 22 hours a day.
22 hours a day.
Indeed, and sometimes even less, even worse at the weekends.
Okay, well,
I
we'll
did
get
some
into
Zooming during COVID, and you can imagine what it was like then.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that in a couple of minutes just with the Justice Secretary. So let's remind ourselves then of what is going on. Daniel Khalif has been caught, but how on earth did he escape? This drama's opened up an argument about exactly what's going on in the whole prison system. Many jails in England and Wales are full to bursting. 61% of them are too full, according to the government's own figures. And there aren't enough staff to cope. Charlie's latest report said major staff shortfalls continued to have a devastating effect. Despite recent hiring, there are still 10% fewer officers than in 2010. Well, Alex Chalk is the man charged of fixing all of this. The new Justice Secretary, welcome to the studio for the first time. Now, we can't talk about Daniel Khalif's alleged crimes, but we can talk about what is going on in Wandsworth Jail. Were there enough staff on duty on the day he escaped with the right training?
OK, well, first thing to say is I want to thank the Metropolitan Police for seizing him. I also want to stress that these are very rare events. But when it came to light, I initiated two investigations. An investigation first into the circumstances of his escape, but also to the issue of categorisation. But I also asked for an independent investigation so that when we get those conclusions, they will be rock solid. Now, in terms of, I asked for preliminary results by the end of this week. We are now at the end of the week. And I am able to say that it's clear that the relevant security protocols were in place. In other words, protocols about the head count that must be made after goods are unloaded from a lorry, for example, about the searches that should take place to a vehicle before it goes through the airlock and leaves. Those protocols were in place. And second, to your specific question, the relevant security staff were in place.
So there were enough staff and they did follow all of the rules, including on vehicle searches?
Now this is the point. So the real question is, were the relevant protocols followed to the extent that they should be? And that is precisely what we need this investigation, and indeed the independent investigation to get to the bottom of. Because look, this clearly was a very serious matter. Yes, very rare, and much rarer incidentally than 20 years ago or so, but we've got to get to the bottom of it, and those investigations are in place.
But, Minister, we know that on a very regular basis there weren't enough staff in Wandsworth Jail. And a recent report said that actually more than 30% of prison officers were either absent or unable to work. Staffing has been a repeated issue there.
Well, so staffing is something that is an absolute priority. And you mentioned right just in your opening remarks that the numbers are ticking up. It's worth reflecting an additional 4,000 or so since 2016. But
well,
also,
hang on, it's still down on 2010.
That's true. That's true.
So there was a real fall off, and then in recent years it started to tick up.
Exactly.
But let's get that completely clear.
I want to deal with this point very specifically. So, since May 2022, the numbers have gone up by 700 in that time, which is to your point. But here's the really, really important point, is that the so-called attrition rate, that's to say the rate at which prison officers leave, is down by a very meaningful amount. And that's because we've done really important things to address that. One, we've accepted in full the Prison Service Pay Review Body recommendations on pay. Second, we've invested £100 million to improve security. That's to say, every prison officer having body-worn cameras. That's important because in potentially volatile situations, you can dial down the temperature and ensure that what might have escalated de-escalates, and to really support our prison officers who do an exceptional job. It is a difficult job.
But let's come back to what happened at Wandsworth on that day. So you've said explicitly there were enough staff doing the job when he escaped. Did they have adequate training? Because sources we've spoken to this week have questioned whether or not prison officers, especially newer ones who are coming in to replace those who were lost to the service, have not always had adequate training.
So as I say, the critical thing is were the protocols properly enforced and followed, and that would obviously want to consider the issues of training. If I could just make the point, what I can say is that the protocols which deal with things like having unloaded the goods from the van, about whether a call should be made to the control room to confirm a physical head count. That protocol was in place. Now, you might think that's a sort of fairly straightforward, common sense point. But second, as to whether the equipment for looking underneath a vehicle, was that in place? Yes. Was the staff in place on the gate? Yes. Plainly, we've got to get to the bottom of what precisely was done by the relevant individuals. But just finally, that's got to happen methodically and fairly to all involved.
But it sounds from what you're saying, the rules were there. So the vehicle should have been checked correctly. There were enough staff. It suggests that, therefore, this was human error.
It would be quite wrong for me to prejudice the outcome of that. So, as I say, I hope to be able to announce next week the terms of reference for that independent investigation. And it's right, because it's independent, that it reaches full and fair conclusions. I have absolute confidence in the senior leadership of HMPPS to do their own very rigorous, very searching investigation, which has already taken place. But in fairness to that investigation, it has to be allowed to take its course without me prejudging it.
The problem, though, here is there is a widespread pattern of flags and concerns having been raised about Wandsworth. There have been reports that there was a similar escape in 2019. Was your department recently receiving warnings and requests for help from Wandsworth?
Well, let me just address the specific issue of Wandsworth. As a result of the specific incident and the context you've referred to, that's why there are senior prison service staff on site. That's why there's additional governor support, a former governor who has specific involvement in with security.
That's not my question. No, this is an important question.
But I've got to specifically address the issue of Wandsworth, because you've asked about Wandsworth.
And I'm asking you, though, but my question is whether or not your department received recent warnings and requests for help from the London Prison Service or from the jail itself to deal with the situation there.
Well, look, we look very carefully. Charlie was talking a few moments ago about Pentonville, or you're talking about Belmarsh. We are in very close contact with all of these prisons. Of course we are. But I want to make this specific point, if I may.
I'd like you to answer this specific question. Did your department receive warnings about the state of Wandsworth Prison in the run-up to this escape?
Well, one of the really important things that Charlie does, brilliantly if I may say so, through his inspectorate, but there are also the IMBs, the Independent Monitoring Boards, and there are plenty of bodies that are interfacing precisely with my department. So the points that have been made about crowding, which are fair points, I should stress, however, that this is the situation that was in place. Crowding has been there in the London prisons for 25, 30 years. The difference is, if I may respectfully say so, that this is the government that is doing something about it. And by the way, not just prospectively, we have actually invested £4 billion. This is the second largest programme in government after HS2 to roll out modern, decent, rehabilitative prisons. So if I go to Five Wells, for example, or Fossway, these are exceptional prisons, and I'd love you to come and visit. Really safe, decent, rehabilitative. HMP Millsike is under construction right now so that we can build capacity but quality too.
But hang on, the Ministry of Justice budget in 2019 was around a quarter lower than it was in 2010. Money has been taken out of this service year after year. Now, it has been topped up in the last few years. But do you accept that one of the reasons why there are so many problems in our prisons is because for many years money was being taken out and whittled away?
Well, it's certainly the case in 2010. In 2010, the situation was we inherited an appalling situation financially, and everyone knows that. We were spending about £750 billion a year, but we were only raising in tax revenue about £600 billion a year. So that's why, health and education were protected quite appropriately. But it's quite, there were challenges in the Justice Department. But as you rightly point out, in recent years, there's been huge investment. And this £4 billion investment is the biggest investment in the prison service since the Victorian
and you
era.
obviously want to emphasise but there have been many criticisms
it's about decency
of how
as
things
well
have
as
gone
security.
in the last few years. We've got Charlie Taylor with us in the studio this
Yes.
morning, who's the Chief Inspector of Prisons. Charlie, I'm sure you'll have been listening very carefully. The Cabinet Minister wants to emphasise money that is going in now, but does it wash what he's saying about staffing in Wandsworth?
Well, I think Wandsworth is a prison that for many years has struggled, and I think if you look at funding for prison and you look at conditions in prison, I remember when the 2019 urgent notification came out from Feltham, and I bumped into my predecessor, but for David Ramsbottom, who sadly died recently. And he said to me, before you look at the Feltham report for 2019, look at my own report for Feltham for 1999. And actually, you could have cut and pasted between the two reports. So this is an issue that's been going on for long periods of time. And I think there's a much longer term question about who we want to lock up, how long we want to lock people up for, and what we want to happen to people when they are locked up.
Just as we've got you here, Minister, for your first interview as Justice Secretary, you clearly, as a former barrister, you care about the criminal justice system. Instinctively, would you like us to lock up more or fewer people?
Look, one of the things you know as a barrister is you respect the courts, and therefore you have to give effect to the order of the court. Now, if the judge says, having considered all the material, having considered the plea and mitigation, the evidence from the prosecution, that X, Y, Z sentence is required, my duty as the Secretary of State is to give effect to the order of the court.
But politicians decide.
No, of course, and that is absolutely correct. So look, we have got to make sure that we are keeping the public safe. When I came into office, I said I wanted to ensure that the guilty are convicted, the innocent walk free, and the public are protected. So, of course, Act 1, Scene 1 is to protect the public.
But is the population too high? Because it is much higher than it was, say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago.
Well, it's not much higher than 10 years ago, but it is higher than it was 20 years ago. Look, the issue is, notwithstanding the proper point you make about sentencing guidelines and judges faithfully and brilliantly give effect to those, but we also have to recognise there are issues of public confidence. So when, for example, an appalling case like Wayne Couzens, the British people are rightly saying, yes, there should be a whole life order there, because what took place was so appalling, was such an affront to basic human decency about the way he behaved that he should spend the rest of his life in bars. Now, we have to respond to that. We have to give effect to the order of the court, and we have to uphold public confidence. But it's also the case that where, for example, the Magistrates Court or indeed Crown Court judges say, do you know what, there's going to be an unpaid work order here rather than sending someone to custody. We need to have seriously robust community orders which rehabilitate people as well as punish offenders.
So there's a lot on your to-do list in the Justice Department. Let's talk about an important story this morning revealed by the Sunday Times. Allegedly, a parliamentary staffer arrested for spying for the Chinese, targeting senior Conservatives. Now, Downing Street has expressed its concern. We understand Rishi Sunak has expressed his concern to the Chinese Premier this morning at G20. But what are you actually going to do about this as a government? I mean, have the Conservatives been taking the threat of China seriously enough? Because maybe this suggests you haven't.
Well, look, I mean, the Prime Minister has framed the issue of China very well. He's called it an epoch-defining challenge. So you cannot wish away China. China is the world's second biggest economy. When we try to address climate change, China is responsible for about 28, 29, 30% of global emissions. We in the UK are 1% of global emissions. So just let me just address that. So on the specific point, however, on this issue of threat, in the instant case, let the police do their job. If there are to be proceedings, we don't want to say anything which prejudices those proceedings. But we proceed with caution when it comes to China. So that means we stand up for human rights. We stand up for the rule of law. But what it also means is that we strip out Huawei, for example, from our 5G network. So I'm from Cheltenham, we have GCHQ in Cheltenham, and they will be playing their part as well to ensure that we are cyber secure. And that is something which is why we call it an epoch-defining challenge. It means that you engage, but you engage with caution.
Some of your colleagues, though, including Conservatives like the former leader, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, think that you should be much tougher, that China should be declared as a threat. The former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, believes that as well. Shouldn't you be taking a more aggressive line?
Well, we have to take a calibrated line. That's the point. I think it would be wrong, and the British government is in the right position. It would be totally wrong to simply disengage. And incidentally, our other G7 allies, if you look at France, you look at Germany, they're adopting a similar approach as well. So, of course, there are plenty of things taking place in China which we are right to raise with the Chinese. We will always uphold our values as a rule of law nation, as a nation that believes in human rights, fundamental human rights, and we won't be afraid to assert them. But it would be quite wrong to pretend they don't exist and don't engage, given that livelihoods in our country depend upon what happens in Beijing. It's right to engage.
Okay, and lastly, a few minutes ago you were talking about your belief that the public want to see people who should stay in jail, who are a danger, stay in jail. Now, viewers might remember the terrible case of the murder of Joanna Simpson.
Yeah.
She was killed by Robert Brown, her husband. Now, this is important now because there's an impending parole decision about whether or not he should be let out after 12 years, I believe, of his sentence. I know you met her family recently. I think we can show viewers an image of that meeting. Can you tell us when that decision is coming and how sympathetic are you to their case?
You know what, when it was one of the first meetings I had as Justice Secretary, and it was so appalling to hear what happened. I found it personally very painful to hear, and you know what I said is I will do everything I properly can within the law to keep the British people safe and to ensure there is justice in her case. There is not much more I can properly say because there is a danger that, frankly, you prejudge issues. I'm not going to prejudge them. I will address them as I can. But she has the family have my word, and Hetty, her friend, has my word. We will do everything we can to keep her safe and to ensure there's justice in her case.
Okay, Justice Secretary Alex Chalk, thank you very much for being with us and with our viewers this morning for the first time in your new job. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let us know what you thought of the Justice Secretary's answers about all of the dramatic events that have happened in his short time of the job so far. You can email me, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. If you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag #BBCLauraK, and we'll try and share some of your conversation later in the programme. And the headlines, as ever, are unfolding on the BBC Live page. The address is there for you now. Now then, to my table trio. Charlie, there you were highlighting the long-term issues here. Alex Chalk obviously wanted to highlight what the government's been doing in the last couple of years, but was he realistic about the scale of the problems?
Well, it is an enormous challenge, and I think when you just look at things like recruitment, it's not just about the pipeline of people coming in, it's also about the quality of people coming in and the fact that many people are leaving the job after quite short periods of time. And one of the reasons for that, and governors tell me this, is that governors themselves have no part in the selection of staff who come and work in their jail.
Well, the boss can't choose their staff.
The boss can't choose their staff. And I'm a former head teacher, and I sit there aghast at some of the things that governors can't do. They can't commission work. I spoke to a governor last week who said that in order to buy a pot of paint, she had to go through some long procurement exercise through the centre rather than simply send someone down to Howdens to buy
a pot of paint.
To buy a pot of paint to decorate themselves. So there's a sort of bureaucracy around prisons which makes things incredibly complicated and means that governors, some of them unbelievably impressive people who do an absolutely brilliant job, but often their hands are tied by what seems to me, coming from an education background, like an extraordinary level of bureaucracy.
Some of the Conservatives are always talking about getting rid of bureaucracy and red tape, and it sounds actually in this situation that the prison service is hamstrung.
I think what's interesting about it is that bureaucracy in these instances are so complex that I don't think many ministers actually understand it, and they don't really understand the pinch points that Charlie is talking about. So if there was a movement, instead of just talking about it in cash terms, the money is the money. It's not going to change, and it probably isn't going to improve for a while. So what are the other things that can be done? And removing bureaucracy, removing centralisation might be one of the things that actually opens this up, and might not be the whole answer, but it might help to a greater extent.
Stephen, what did you make of what the Minister was saying?
I was disappointed that he mentioned Wayne Couzens, because it's a bit like the tabloid press. 64, I believe, % of their crime reporting is on violent crime. 6%, I think it is, of prisoners in prison are violent criminals. In other words, the vast majority in prisons are not that kind of a threat. It's drugs, it's things that are related to mental health and to their conditions of living, and these are reproduced and amplified by being in prison. And to be scary about it and say we must keep everybody safe. Well, of course we must keep people safe, but to use that as an excuse for simply continuing down the same path seems to me to be very foolish.
But Charlie, give us some historical perspective, because if you go back, and we've been looking at the numbers in the last couple of days, say 20 years ago, we did lock up far fewer people than we do now. The minister there was reluctant to actually reveal whether he would like to see a higher or lower prison population, but how is it changed?
Well, if you go back to the mid-1990s, when actually crime was much higher than it is now, our prison population was half what it is, or pretty much half what it is today. I think it was around 42, 44,000. And it's now gone up to over 88,000. The projections are that it will go up even further. And the problem is, if it goes up even further, what that means is more prisoners sharing cells that were designed for one person, continuing to use these old, battered, crumbling, vermin-infested Victorian jails, which would make fantastic museums or flats, but really are not fit for purpose for the 21st century. But also that there aren't enough staff in place to be able to unlock prisoners and actually to begin to do the things with prisoners that are actually going to help them to not offend when they come out. Prisons have got a public protection duty to keep people locked up when they're inside, but they also have a public protection duty to make sure that they put in place the things that mean that when someone leaves prison, they're less likely to reoffend.
And reoffending
and
rates
you won't
are really
rehabilitate
high.
someone if they're banged up in their cell for
Oscar
22
Wilde,
hours a day.
after he left Reading Jail for 2 years hard labour, he wrote a letter to the press in which he said, in a Christian or in a civilised society, when a prisoner leaves, they should be embraced, they should be welcomed, they should be thanked, they should be congratulated. They are free, they have served their time. But in England, he said, when you leave prison, that is where your sentence begins.
But Salma, there is, though, politicians pick up on public concern, don't they? Do you think you're going to see at any point in the near term a politician making the kinds of arguments that Stephen's been making about rehabilitation and getting numbers down?
This is exactly the point. I mean, which politician, whatever party they're from, is going to put front and centre in their manifesto that they want prison reform and that's going to be their focus?
Do they privately believe it and they just don't say it publicly?
No, I think there are some that privately believe it. I mean, actually, Danny Kruger MP, who's on the backbenches, I believe, he's done a lot on prisoner reform. So there are pockets of people who actually do care about this issue. But on a macro level, are they going to stake an election on issues like prison reform and rehabilitation? But just to go back to something you said, you asked the Justice Secretary, does he want to see a lower prison population or a higher prison population? The answer is very simple. You want a lower prison population because you want crime to be reduced and for fewer people to have custodial sentences as a result. And that is a longer train thing rather than just talking about prison reform.
And that's also a big challenge for any government and this government probably as we're on the runway to the next general election. Let's talk about something else that affects every one of us in a different way, the conflict in Ukraine, which is going on. Now, Stephen, you've just been to Ukraine. You met the Zelenskys, I think, while you were there. Tell us a bit about what you were doing.
I was invited by the President's office, in fact by the First Lady's office, Alina Zelenska, the wife of the President, to host a summit on mental health there. I was so impressed that a country at war would host a summit on mental health, that it isn't just presenting an image of resilience, it's also presenting an image of fragility, which I thought was honest and remarkable. And it's clear that traumatic mental health issues strike the nation very hard, not just soldiers who have suffered. I think thousands have lost limbs already, thousands and thousands, and that carries huge mental burden and strain. But children every day being taken down to air raid shelters, every day having to worry about what's happening to their father or their mother who are at the front. So I thought this is obviously something I couldn't turn down, plus curiosity. I've never been in a war zone, hadn't ever been to Ukraine.
And what actually happened when you were there?
Well, there was an air raid the night before the summit, actually. A great screeching woke me from my slumbers at about 4:30 in the morning, and I was told to go down to the basement. We knew where that was. There were signs saying shelter as soon as we went to the hotel, so we were aware. And down I went. There were a few people there. The staff were there. There was water and a coffee machine. They were quite smart. They knew that the early warning was such that there'd be, if there were a serious threat to Kyiv itself, there'd be a later warning. And indeed that happened. An explosion was apparently heard and others then came down and the bomb shelter was full. It was alarming in every sense of the word. It was no threat to me. That it was apparently some drones that were downed by their defence, so there wasn't even a building hit. But it was a reminder, and this happens 4, 5, 6 times a week.
And what was the thing that most struck you about all of the people you met? I know you met some bereaved families.
Well, their commitment to the war was really interesting. I mean, of course, they hate that it's happening. I spoke to a woman who had lost her husband only 2 weeks earlier, and her husband was an artist, a musician, and she was an artist too. And they said that a lot of their friends who were of the more militaristic caste, if you like, hadn't volunteered early on, but a lot of artists had. And if you know anything about the history of Ukraine, in the 1930s, they had what they called the executed Renaissance, a flowering of artists and thinkers and poets and painters who were all gulagged or shot by Stalin's Soviets. And this happened again in the 60s. Tyrants do that. Putin does it. The intellectuals, the intelligentsia, whom we mock at home because we have the freedom to do so, they're the first target. And so they were the first to volunteer. It was very revealing. And my goodness, they hate the Russians. They want this war to carry on until they know they have won.
One of the interesting things about it, Selma, is not just the determination, which took many other countries by surprise, the determination of Ukraine to fight, but also in this country at least, the political consensus for supporting Ukraine is rock solid. That seems to be fracturing a bit on the other side of the Atlantic, but here at least it's rock solid. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a part of me that wants to say that it's the idea of British exceptionalism and, you know, invoking Churchill in the Second World War. I think, though, that, and actually there's an element of this about the EU as well. Britain has always had a sort of difficulty, or parts of Britain have had a difficulty with Russia as a threat in Europe. Mainland Europe has generally considered Russia as a partner and not an ally, but a partner that they have to do business with because of energy supply, etc., Germany in particular. Now, I know people will talk about, you know, lots of wealthy Russians coming here, but it's not the same thing as sort of our geopolitical positioning. And I think that has always been something that we have been concerned about. Our worry about Russia as a threat on our doorstep has always been a little bit more acute than the American fear around China, or indeed the Europeans having to work with Russia much more closely.
Very interesting indeed. Now, we were talking a few minutes ago about that extraordinary story about allegedly a parliamentary staffer being arrested for spying for China. A few minutes ago, the Prime Minister was asked about this while he's at the G20 summit in Delhi. This is what he had to say.
We have a new act in Parliament that allows us to stop foreign investment into sensitive sectors of our economy, which we deem to be unsuitable. And we're passing new laws in Parliament to ensure the registration of foreign individuals who are operating in particular activities in the UK, other laws to protect our higher educational institutions from undue interference or influence. So all these things are happening.
And no doubt you'll be able to follow the rest of that story as it unfolds across the rest of the BBC today. Now, as we've just been talking about, the real-life consequences of the conflict in Ukraine for men, women and children are profound. The country's incredible resistance, Stephen was telling us about, to the Russian invasion has been bolstered by billions and billions of pounds and dollars from the West. Over the summer, Ukraine has been trying to push back Putin's forces, the summer offensive, and there's been some success. But for how long can they rely on weapons and vital support from other countries? The Chief of the UK's Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, has been in Washington this week with his counterpart and friend, the head of the American military, General Mark Milley. And we were able to speak to both of them exclusively, side by side. And we asked how much progress is really being made in Ukraine and who's winning right now.
Sure. Well, first, how do you define winning? And I think all the political leaders of NATO and Europe and the United States certainly have said repeatedly over time in the last year and a half that what does winning look like? At the end of the day, Ukraine must remain a free, sovereign, independent country with its territory intact. Russia, under the leadership of Putin, conducted an illegal, aggressive military invasion of a country that presented no military threat to Russia. It was an illegal war of aggression by a very large country against a relatively small country, against their neighbor. If Putin's invasion is allowed to stand, then those rules, those principles are for nothing. All of World War II will have been fought for nothing. We're not fighting for Ukraine, and Ukraine hasn't asked for anybody to fight for them. All they're asking for is help. They're asking for material help and training and ammunition, and that's exactly what the international community is giving them in order to keep them free and allow them to defend themselves.
And if I could add, Laura, Ukraine is winning and Russia is losing. And Ukraine is winning because the aim of Russia was to subjugate Ukraine and to put it under Russia's control. And that has not happened, and it never will happen. And that's why Ukraine is winning. And Ukraine is making progress in its battle to regain its territory. It's recovered 50% of the ground that Russia seized. And you're seeing the international community also applying economic pressure and diplomatic pressure. And Russia is suffering because of that. And it's broken these rules and it's paying the cost.
Do you agree, General Milley? There have been fears Ukraine's summer offensive hasn't gone as well as hoped.
That offensive kicked off about 90 days ago. It has gone slower than the planners anticipated. But that is the difference between what Clausewitz called war on paper and real war. So these are real people in real vehicles that are fighting through real minefields, and there's real death and destruction, there's real friction. And there's still a reasonable amount of time, probably about 30 to 45 days worth of fighting weather left. So the Ukrainians aren't done, this battle's not done. They haven't finished the fighting part of what they're trying to accomplish. So we'll see. It's too early to say how this is going to end. They at least have achieved partial success in what they set out to do. And that's important. And then the rains will come in. It'll become very muddy and it'll be very difficult to maneuver at that point. And then you'll get the deep winter. And then at that point, we'll see where things go. But right now, it is way too early to say that this offensive is failed or not failed.
But can the West's support for Ukraine just go on without limit?
I would point you in the direction of the comments of our leaders and the clarity that they have all provided in terms of sticking with Ukraine, both in the here and now and also for the long term. When you look at that international partnership and you compare it to what Russia has, and Russia is acting principally on its own, and then where it looks for help, it looks to dubious partners like Iran and North Korea. And it's really clear which side any sensible nation would want to be on and what the heft of that larger international community can provide.
But the departing Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, suggested Ukraine can't rely on the West like an Amazon service for weaponry.
To say whether it's, like an Amazon sort of thing, that's an analogy I personally wouldn't use, but sure. We are supplying them, we're supporting them, and we are going to continue to do that as long as our political leadership deems that. And I will tell you that it's having real results on the battlefield.
But what would the consequences be if that support comes to an end?
If we don't do that, then I think Ukraine will be at a very, very great military disadvantage. But I will also say, regardless of support, the Ukrainian people are not going to stop fighting. They have been free since 1991, and the best I can tell, they have demonstrated incredible courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. And it is very unlikely that the Ukrainian people will stop fighting until they achieve their objectives.
What is going on in Moscow? Putin seems to be cozying up to North Korea.
I think it's much more in the territory of desperation. It's a reflection of the catastrophic mistake that Russia made by invading Ukraine. And it's a reflection of how few partners Russia has around the world and where it needs to seek help. And it's also a reflection of the domestic situation in Russia. You've got to look at the fact that the economy is under pressure. The sanctions are having a greater impact. It doesn't have a raft of international partners. It's lost 500,000 people that have fled the country. There's at least 1 million more that want to leave the country. It's struggling to have enough people to keep supporting the war. So this is an act of desperation, and that's why we need to focus on Ukraine, focus on the resolve and the will to fight of Ukraine, and that is why we continue to support Ukraine, and we need to reflect on Russia's desperation and see it for what it is.
Now the US presidential race is hotting up. General Milley, would US men and women in uniform serve a commander-in-chief in jail?
Well, as you know, Laura, our oath of allegiance for the United States military is to the Constitution. It is not, the United States military is unique in that. We don't take an oath to a king, a queen, a country, a president, a tribe, a religion, or any of that. We take our oath to a document, the Constitution of the United States of America. So we will be faithful always to that Constitution regardless of who occupies the White House, and we will obey all lawful orders from whoever is the duly elected President of the United States. It's as simple as that. I would just tell you that you can take it to the bank that the United States military, all of us in uniform, are faithful to the United States Constitution. That's what we took our oath to. That's what we're willing to die to protect.
But are you concerned about the extremes in America, especially with what we saw on the 6th of January Capitol attack?
The United States military does what it needs to do in accordance with the law, and we obey the legal and lawful orders of the President of the United States as duly constituted and elected. And we maintain our faith and allegiance and we support and defend that Constitution. It doesn't get complicated, Laura. That's what the United States military does. That's what we've always done, and that's what we always will do.
And Admiral Radakin, you've just been given one of the highest honours America can bestow, the Legion of Merit. What does that mean to you? And General Milley, how special is it?
It was an enormous privilege, and it's very humbling. I am delighted to receive that award, and it's a reflection of a personal relationship, but it's really about a professional relationship between our two countries and what that signifies, and it keeps both our nations safe, and it's something that really is very, very special.
And the Legion of Merit is one of the highest awards in the military system of the United States, and it's the highest award that we give to non-United States officers. And it really signifies, as Tony just said, the relationship between the United States and the UK. And even though we had a rough start at the very beginning, we have been shoulder to shoulder in so many conflicts, and we have a bond in blood, common values, and the relationship between the British military and the American military is as strong as it'll ever be. And in a few minutes, right after this interview, we'll take Admiral Radakin over to Arlington, and he will lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This is a place of hallowed ground for the American military. We're very proud of it, and I think it's a great honor for us to have Tony lay a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown here in a few minutes.
And lastly, General, you're about to stand down after an extraordinary career. What's next? Might politics beckon? You wouldn't be the first.
Absolutely not. So I have zero desire whatsoever to enter into politics. I don't intend to do that. I'm a grandfather. My wife and I are going to look after the kids and the grandkids, and we'll do all that, and I'll do whatever's necessary in the future as long as I can draw a breath to defend the United States of America and defend its Constitution. Where that direction takes me, I don't know, but I can tell you one direction it won't take me is into active elective politics.
And I'm going to restrict myself to saying that I really wish Mark a happy retirement, and I value our friendship, I value our relationship both as a personal level but also at a professional level, and I'm not too sure that I would wish to curse him with some kind of endorsement for a life in politics. I think happy retirement and whatever Mark wants to do, and I'm sure that our friendship and relationship will endure in the years to come.
I'm going to run for best granddad. That's it.
I'm sure somewhere in the world there is a political contest for best granddad, but the two heads of the military on both sides of the Atlantic speaking to us exclusively there. Now, back to home. A few months ago, Labour's Shadow Business and Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds said that voters were yet to comprehend the scale of Labour's ambition for the economy. What does he reckon now? Well, he's here in the studio. Let's start, though, Jonathan, with the big story of the week, the escape of Daniel Khalif. Now, the Justice Secretary a few moments ago told us that all of the protocols were in place and there were enough staff. But is Labour satisfied with the government's explanations so far?
Well, we will surely need an independent investigation to find out exactly what the details of this are. I think, to be frank, most people will have seen this story this week, and perhaps on the back of the story about schools falling down at the start of the week, and again they will feel there is simply nothing working as it should under this government after 13 years. And I would say, because the problems with this government, whatever had happened this week, there would have been plenty to talk about, and it probably would have involved public services not living up to the people's expectations. But we do recognise the danger here is not just that people have made their mind upon the government, that they are losing hope that British government can be better than this. And we recognise that. We recognise the responsibility that comes with that on our side. But I sometimes, in terms of the advice we receive, I would always say to everyone, you provide people with that hope with meaningful change, the change that people think you can deliver, and that needs some solid foundations, particularly when it comes to economic and
Let's
business
talk about
policy.
something meaningful, though, in terms of the prison service. I mean, Labour has been very critical of the government's handling of it, but would you commit to increasing funding?
Well, perhaps the most extraordinary thing when you look at this is, in the government's own spending plans, they actually put a significant amount of money into capital spending because prisons are so stretched. Now, they haven't actually spent it. I think they spent 1.3 billion of the £4 billion allocation as it stands. So the first thing to say would be spend the money and get on with your plans. But again, it's a key area of public services that are just not delivering as the people expect.
Would you commit to spending more? Do you think it needs more cash?
Well, look, whatever area we're talking about, whether it's schools, criminal justice, the NHS, I will always bring that back to the fact that if we want and need to return to the kind of public investment we saw, frankly, under the last Labour government, the economy has to do better. If we've got the kind of growth rates we've had since 2010, if we've got low productivity, low wages, all of that limits the money you can spend on public services. So, of course, that's important because what I want is good jobs in every part of the country, but it clearly has an impact on what you can spend on public services. That's why my area is so important.
And you've said that the government hasn't done enough to increase and support the number of manufacturing jobs, but the reality is we are overwhelmingly a service-based economy. Manufacturing is about a tenth of the economy, and it has been for quite some time. How big would you actually want it to be?
Well, first of all, we should never accept there's some sort of false choice between backing services or backing manufacturing. A healthy economy promotes all sectors. And I would just say, yes, we obviously recognise we are much more a services economy than in the past, but where manufacturing exists, it is high value, it is high wage, it is not some sort of sunset industry, and a crucial task is making sure that it can make the transition to net zero. What we're pointing out today is if you look at the scale of ambition from, say, the Americans with President Biden and his industrial policy, we cannot ignore the impact that has had on how relatively attractive we are to investment. We have the lowest business investment already in the G7. And I know people want to always talk about how much money would go into this public service or that.
I'm not asking you that. I'm asking you how big you would like manufacturing to be.
I wouldn't put a percentage on it because it's relative to other parts.
But you're criticising the government for not making it big enough, but then you won't tell us how big you'd like it to be.
I would simply say there are jobs available in whether we're looking at the supply chain for automotive and electric batteries, if we're looking at the future of aerospace, if we're looking at things that will be integral to this new modern economy that we're moving towards, there are opportunities that we're not building on. I wouldn't put percentage on it, but on some of this I would worry about actually losing jobs, as we have done. I mean, the Americans are gaining jobs in manufacturing, we are losing jobs, and that shouldn't be the case if we had the same level of ambition.
But one of the prominent people who's meant to be on your side, Sharon Graham, the boss of the Unite Union, she thinks that your plans maybe don't really add up to that much. She said changes to planning laws and partnering, giving free money to corporations without commitments won't move the dial. The truth is, without a real economy reboot, talk of high growth is for the birds. So if a leader of one of the biggest unions in the country who's meant to be on your side isn't convinced, why should anybody watching be convinced?
Well, look, I would just reject that analysis entirely. I would say if you look at, for instance, sectors that are crucial, where there are significant numbers of Unite members, whether that's aerospace or automotive or the steel industry, our plans, our Green Prosperity Plan, is to put significant amount of public investment in order to partner with the private investment that is required. That is the big transition. Without that, we will lose these sectors.
But we can remind our viewers, and I'm sure some of them will be remembering this themselves, that big commitment of borrowing 28 billion to create or to support creating those new industries, you're doing that more slowly than you'd originally hoped.
Well, no, we just clarified that, of course, our fiscal rules are the overwhelming framework, the overarching framework that is in place to do that. And, of course, this is not about taking whatever the government are doing and just adding an arbitrary figure on top. It's an assessment of what is required to get the maximum economic benefits for this country in terms of good jobs from this transition to net zero. And that does require a degree of public investment. But, changes to planning and changes to the apprenticeship levy and the skills system, making Brexit work better, devolving power to parts of the country where economic policy could work better. These are not small commitments. Yeah. And again, I oppose any sense that meaningful change that adds up to a substantial, much more comprehensive industrial policy for this country is in some way small beer, because it's not. These are the things that will attract and change those big private investment partners.
But it was interesting, you did say earlier in the year you weren't sure if people really got that yet, if they understood how ambitious you really are. Do you think they understand now?
Well, I simply have the humility to say that no one on the Labour side thinks the job is done. We know people in many cases have made up their mind on the government. I think they're right to judge their record over that 13 years. But there's a responsibility on us to keep with that message of how change will make a real tangible difference. Not because we're announcing things or got aspiration or getting into whether this is where it sits on a political spectrum, but real change that will make a difference to their lives. And I would simply, again, look to the scale of some of our policies. I mean, look at the growth of the gig economy in the last few years. In some ways, it's to be welcomed, but it has come, in some cases, at the expense of working conditions and employment rights. We're going to change that. Look at what we need to do on some of our big sectors of the economy to make that transition. We're going to do and put that in place. Look at things like making Brexit work better. These are not small things, but they can be delivered by an ambitious government.
There'll all be things I'm sure we'll talk about with you in the coming months, but I must ask you about this story this morning about allegedly a parliamentary staffer spying for China. Now, when there was a similar issue not so long ago with a Labour MP, Barry Gardner, that was affected your party, are you confident now that there won't be similar allegations involving people spying for the Labour Party?
No, I'm appalled by these allegations, with the usual caveats that we'll obviously have an investigation in place, but democracy, freedom, the rule of law are integral to the UK, and that any country may seek to interfere in that in some way would be absolutely shocking. I imagine on the Conservative side, this news this morning was something they didn't know about. It's a shock to them, so I don't think anyone can give those assurances. We'll have to work with the security services about this. But on China policy more broadly, there is clearly a set of economic relationships which are already in place. You can't just decouple from China, but you can't treat China like an American or a European company coming through. So we've got to be, it's a mix of cooperation where that's possible, but we'll have to confront these issues where they exist.
And does Labour believe that China is a threat to the UK?
I think when you have a story like this, it would be naive to say anything other than that. There are areas where I think that economic relationship can be a positive one and actually might, over the long term, be a positive thing, but you cannot treat it in the same way, especially when you've got these appalling and shocking allegations today.
OK, Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. It's always great to have you in the studio. Now, it is nearly 10 o'clock and we started this morning talking to the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, after another messy week for the government with a terror suspect escaping from jail. I asked him if he knew yet what had gone wrong at Wandsworth Jail.
It's clear that the relevant security protocols were in place. The relevant security staff were in place.
So there were enough staff and they did follow all of the rules, including on vehicle searches?
Now, this is the point. So the real question is, were the relevant protocols followed to the extent that they should be?
Now, as ever, you have been getting in touch. Thank you for letting us know what you think. On jails, Brian Kirk said if they have to spend 23 hours in their cell, it will give them time to think about their impact on their victims. But Claire Riley, a different viewer, wonders how many people are in prison purely because they have been failed by mental health services. Thank you, as ever, for sharing their views. We do read them all, and as you know, we use them as questions on the programme sometimes. So thank you very much indeed for getting in touch. Now, Labour, of course, as we've just heard from Jonathan Reynolds, is always keen to talk about how tricky things have been for the Conservatives in the last few years. Whatever your political views, the reality is it has been an incredibly bumpy, chaotic time. So here at the BBC, we set out to work out why in a new documentary series that someone sitting close to here, well, me, has been working on for the last few months.
This place is meant to be in charge.
Thank you very much.
But with 5 Prime Ministers in 6 years, it hasn't felt that way.
We became a laughingstock.
I don't know a single MP who didn't get a death threat.
I have been a systematic plotter who's tried to remove the Prime Minister.
I said he won't be satisfied until he burns the house down.
In the way President Trump used to operate, I was sacked on Twitter. I said, I think you've got 3 weeks now.
Just how close did our political system come to falling apart?
I think we lost our minds.
And will it ever be the same again?
It is the end of normal.
State of chaos, that's not just describing my life. Salma, you were in government for a lot of that period. We're looking at 2016, from the morning after the referendum until the departure of Liz Truss. Why do you think things went so mad or were so sort of traumatic?
There are a number of reasons. I'm going to watch this programme and be slightly triggered by it. I think that there is a bit of a fundamental failure in terms of the types of people we are recruiting and have in politics. I think there needs to be a big change in mindset of the kind of people who are coming in and what public service actually means. I hear all the time that people say, oh, well, politicians should be paid more and that's why it'll make it better. That's not what public service is. And I think we've also gotten into this playbook that politicians think that they have to answer things in a certain way, they have to do things in a certain way, and that there is a playbook by which they can function. And it's just not true. You have to meet the challenges of the time. And I think that's why there was a lot of chaos, because people just didn't know where to go.
People were trying to follow the same rules in a very fast-changing world. I mean, Stephen, it's been an extraordinary period. You know, COVID, Brexit, all of those things.
Brexit, we must mention Brexit. The Labour Party is afraid to mention it. It was a catastrophe and everybody knows it deep in their bones.
Well, and not everybody would agree with you.
They know it, of course they do. And certainly the rest of the world does. But aside from that, yes, it's funny because it's a clown car crash and you can't help being amused by it. But unfortunately, during that time, so much was taken out of what should be the run of politics. Extraordinary that you can have a conversation with an economics minister in Labour who didn't even mention the climate catastrophe coming, that there's a tsunami coming towards us, which is partly the technology and AI and what's going to happen to work for everybody in this country, almost everybody, and there is the climate crisis. And yet everyone's talking about sort of just doing the same thing, only better. It's catastrophic.
Well, that's similar to what Selma said about the same kind of people coming in and trying to do these things in the same way. But Charlie, from a sort of practical point of view, you know, you're close to public service running. We've seen a huge churn from all these ministers as successive administrations fell over.
I was trying to count the Justice Secretaries since 2010, and I think I've got to 9. And there's one I can't remember, so sorry to whoever that was, but I won't mention names. And then I started trying to do prisons ministers. I'm afraid I got absolutely nowhere with that.
And does it matter?
Of course it matters. If you have that level of a churn, of course it matters, because what happens is you get sort of bureaucratic drift. You get systems that don't have leadership in place, and therefore people are making decisions that aren't necessarily in the best interests of the public. They tend to make decisions, or the danger is they make decisions in the interests of the business. And political churn has been a frustration, I think, for anybody working in public service in the last few years.
Do you think, though, things have now come back to some kind of normal? I mean, that was Rishi Sunak's big promise, really, to the country, is I will end the chaos and we'll just move on and things will be OK.
Well, if Alex Chalk's still here in a year, and Damien Hines is still prisons minister in a year, then maybe we could say that.
Look how many MPs are resigning and saying they're not going to stand at the next election. I think we should stop using the word honourable of MPs until they've earned it. So it wouldn't be an automatic honorarium, as it were, to be called the honourable. Because honour, it may be an old-fashioned word, but it should have some meaning amongst politicians.
Who would decide, Stephen, who got the...
You would have a vote every 3 months from the public as to whether or not this politician
can you lose it as well?
had been honourable.
Yeah. Can you become dishonourable then?
Nobody would get it.
Nobody at all, Selma.
No,
Damning from a former advisor.
There you are.
Goodness me. Well, my very honourable trio at the table this morning, thank you so much for being with us and giving us all of those really interesting insights. Thank you, of course, for your company as always. You can watch the first of that series, State of Chaos, on BBC Two tomorrow night and then each week after. At the end of this week, when events, oh yes, those things, events, have knocked number 10 off course again. There's been attention from the outside on what's going on the inside of jails, which has given another excuse to the Tories' rivals to claim that decisions of past governments are coming home to roost. The smoother start to the autumn political season that Rishi Sunak might have hoped for, what happened to that? The Prime Minister will land back from the summit in India soon, and he might not be blamed for wondering what will have gone wrong by the time he hits the tarmac. You can catch anything you missed today on iPlayer. I'm heading soon to the newscast studio in a few minutes for our next edition of our weekend podcast. Try that out on BBC Sounds if you fancy, and I will look forward, of course, to seeing you back here, same time, same place, next week. Goodbye for now.